Fifth species counterpoint. Rule number 1. Fifth species counterpoint is also known as florid species counterpoint, which means all the species are used in combination. Rule number 2, you may begin with either a half-rest half note, which should be suspended into the next measure, or a quarter rest and 3 quarter notes. So you either begin in fourth species or third species. Rule number 3, the next to last measure should contain a dissonant suspension into the leading tone as it was in fourth species. Rule number 4, in general, whatever species you use in a given measure, the rules for that species apply in that measure. So in measure 1, we're essentially beginning in third species. Measure 4 is an example of second species. Measures 2, 5, and 8 are really a combination of third and fourth, but all the suspensions are treated as if they were in fourth species. Rule number 5, never repeat the same rhythmic combination in consecutive measures. We want every measure to be different rhythmically than the measure preceding it. Measure 6 and 7 is an example of not following that rule. So we have 2 measures with 4 quarter notes consecutively. Even though the first measure, the quarter note, is tied from the half note, we would view this as 4 quarter notes in consecutive measures and thus wrong. Rule number 6, avoid quarter-quarter half combinations except when the half note is tied. So you do not want to have quarter-quarter half note without the half note being tied. The exception to this is the second to the last measure, where we can have quarter note, half note not tied, because we never tie into the last measure. You will notice that there are eighth notes in this species, and we'll talk about those more in just a second. But in this rule, 2 eighth notes on the second beat are equivalent to a quarter note. Rule number 7, never use quarter, half, quarter in any measure. Fifth species, rule number 8. Eighth notes are now allowed, but only on beats 2 or 4, and never 2 and 4. So there will only be 1 pair of eighth notes per measure, either beat 2 or beat 4. Rule number 9, the eighth notes are always used in pairs and in stepwise motion, approaching and leaving. However, a small leap before the eighth notes is allowed. Rule number 10, use suspensions liberally, especially dissonant suspensions. Rule number 11, as in fourth species, all suspensions must be prepared by a half note. Every tie must begin with a half note. You can tie a half note to a half note or a half note to a quarter note, but you may never tie a quarter to a half or a quarter to a quarter, and you may not tie a half note to an eighth note, because eighth notes can only be found on beats 2 or 4. Rule number 12, consonant suspensions can resolve on beat 2 or beat 3 by step or consonant leap. In measures 5 and 6, we have a consonant suspension. The half note F is tied to the quarter note F, which means now we can leave that suspension on beat 2 by stepping up. Now, this note stepping up is a dissonant passing tone, but because it's correctly followed by a consonance on beat 3, this is an example of a correct resolution of a consonant suspension, resolving up by step on beat 2. Fifth species rule number 13. Dissonant suspensions must resolve down by step on beat 3, but they may be decorated on beat 2 by the following. Number 1, a leap to a consonance on beat 2, 2 eighth notes as a lower neighbor on beat 2, or as the anticipation of a resolution on beat 2. In both our examples of dissonant suspensions here, we've used the 2 eighth notes lower neighbor option. So here the C consonant C preparation followed by a dissonant suspension embellished by lower neighbor notes and then resolved on beat 3. So the resolution is the same whether we have a quarter note and 2 eighth notes or if this was a half note C tied to another half note C. Still the resolution would be on beat 3. We are allowed to decorate or embellish beat 2 in fifth species. Rule 14. As before, parallel or hidden fifths occur when both voices move to a downbeat and must always be avoided. Rule 15. Accented fifths or octaves occur on consecutive downbeats in second species and from beat 3 to beat 1 in third species. Both 14 and 15 are the same rules as we had before, but they apply in the same way as they did depending on which species you're using in what measure.